Okay, got it. Okay,
Thank you,
gotcha. Okay.
Jim. I finally got in.
Oh, cool. Oh, good. Okay, awesome. Okay, guys, great to meet everybody. Great to see Jim again, Greg, everybody that I already know. Just wonderful to be here. Yeah, I thought about doing a slide presentation. There are a couple of visuals I could do, but they're not all that useful. And I've done a lot of these Zoom meetings, and it seems like there's usually technical glitches of one kind or another. So I'm just going to talk about what I'm doing here. You know, first of all, guys, I spend a lot of time with Abe these days. You know, I can call him by his first name. I think we're good, okay? Because I didn't actually start off wanting really to do Lincoln or anything related to him. And you know, Greg, you could testify to this. My original love was Civil War military history. Went to Rice, studied under Harold Hyman. Harold got me interested in the legal and political and constitutional aspects of the Civil War. Then went to the University of Kansas and studied under Phil Paladin. And Phil, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is one of the was he passed away in 2007, was one of the leading Lincoln scholars in the U.S. And I've just kind of gone down that road. I thought tonight I would, you know, do a discussion of the book I wrote in 2007 called Lincoln the Lawyer, and I'll talk a bit about what that book entailed. But guys, we'll open this up to question and answer, and I'll talk Lincoln all night long. Or if there's anything else you want to discuss, I've done work on Lincoln's constitutionalism, on his politics. My latest book is called The Black Heavens. It's how Abraham Lincoln processed death and dying during the Civil War. So if we can go into anything you want to, okay. But I thought the law practice is a pretty good place to kind of ground this. Just to start off with, guys, Lincoln was a lawyer. Yeah, and I tell people that, and I usually kind of get this blank stare that's like, well, weren't they all lawyers? I mean, so what? He's a lawyer. It's a big deal, right? Well, I mean, guys, there's more to than that. I mean, yeah, first of all, yeah, over half of our presidents have been trained as attorneys, as lawyers. That comes as no surprise, I'm sure, to anyone. But I mean, come on. I mean, there are lawyers and there are lawyers. I would say for most of our presidents, the law was nothing more than a temporary stepping stone into stuff in politics that they would rather do. You know, for example, people tend to forget Franklin Roosevelt was a lawyer. You know, I've told people that and they're like, "Oh God, was he? Yeah, he had a law degree." And Roosevelt actually practiced law for a little while, and he hated every last minute of it, and he actually got out of it as fast as he possibly could and got off into other things. And you know what, guys, for most of our lawyer presidents, that's more or less the truth, you know. But for Lincoln, it's far more than that. All right, guys, I would argue that Abraham Lincoln is the most experienced trial lawyer we ever put in the White House. The only other president who I think even comes close to him would be John Adams, who had a thriving practice in Boston, of course. But I actually think Lincoln was much more, you know, much more of a lawyer's lawyer than Adams was, you know. And guys, you know, I mean, that's got to be important, right? You know, I mean, I actually added it up. Abraham Lincoln spent 10% of his life as a professional politician. If you add in his time in the State House of Illinois, his time in the Congress, his single term as president, 10% of his life. He spent 40% of his life as an active practicing lawyer at the Illinois bar for 25 years. So this is a big deal. All right. I would argue that it is a neglected topic because, and I'll get into this here in a minute, for the most part, most of Lincoln's biographers don't do much with this. They just haven't really folded into their insights into Lincoln's character, his leadership during the Civil War, into his experiences as a lawyer. So what I want to do tonight is, first of all, I just want to give you an idea of what kind of lawyer he was. You know, what does that actually mean? You know, what does being a lawyer mean in the 25-year period that Lincoln practiced, roughly 1836 to about 1861? What does that mean in that time period? All right. And then second of all, I kind of want to spend a little bit of time talking about what I think the effect of this was on the way he led the country during the Civil War. Okay. So first of all, why would he become a lawyer? We can speculate all day long. He never said. I mean, you know how Lincoln, if you've read anything on Lincoln's stuff, he is buried under layers of legend and myth and all of that. And there's no exception here. There's a legend that when he was only like 9 years old, he went into a courthouse in Indiana and saw a lawyer making an argument and told his dad, "Hey, I'm going to do that someday." And I'm like, yeah, right. There's a lot of that kind of thing. He never really said why he went into the law, but it did make a certain amount of sense because we all know what his early life was like. He had very little formal education, but he was a voracious reader, and a lover of words and a lover of speech making. This goes way back to when he was really quite little. So his temperament fit doing the law. He is also, and this is a part of his character you don't hear a lot about. The man was intensely ambitious. We always tend to think, yeah, Honest Abe, the humble rail splitter. Well, he wasn't that humble, guys. He wanted a career and a substantial one in public life and in politics. And the law was, even back then, a very good stepping stone for that. Also, I mean, hey, he wants to have a profession. And you know what? Back in those days, there really weren't that many choices. Okay, I mean, when you get right down to it, you could go into the ministry, you could go into medicine, or the law. Those are really the only really choices that you've got, especially out on the Illinois frontier. The law made a certain amount of sense because you didn't really have to have, in that time period, a formal college education. Now, many lawyers in that time period did have a college education of some kind, but you didn't have to have it. All right. So this all fit, who he was and where he wanted to go. We think the idea got lodged in his head when he served in the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War. He didn't hardly fire a shot in anger. It wasn't much of a military thing, but he didn't meet a lot of people. And one of the men that he served with, was a man named John Todd Stewart. By the way, if your middle name looks familiar, that's Mary's uncle, so they're related. Okay. He meets John Todd Stewart, who's a lawyer in Springfield, and Stewart saw something in this guy, and he said, "You know what, Abe, you'd make a good lawyer. You got the brain for it. You could do it." And we think that kind of planted the idea. Now, back in those days, interestingly enough, you didn't have to go to law school. As a matter of fact, there were hardly any law schools in America. There were a couple of law schools back in the big eastern cities, but there really weren't even any law schools in existence. And I've told friends of mine who are lawyers today, and they get mad. It's like, dude, I had to spend 3 years and $15,000 to go to law school. This guy got in for nothing. Yeah, they didn't have law schools. Okay. Here's how this whole thing worked. If you wanted to be a lawyer, what you did, you had to have the books, all right, to pass the bar exam. There really weren't that many of them. As a matter of fact, the book that you really had to have was Sir William Blackstone's Commentaries on the English Common Law. And I've told people that, and they're like, why would he read about the British? Well, our system was so similar to the British system that this worked really well for a textbook. And they're four super thick volumes. I read them, and they are a load, man. I mean, they are a real chore to get through these things, but they are the sort of the explanation as to how the law works. You need to get a copy of Blackstone. This is no small thing, guys. We're talking about the frontier here. I mean, there's not a lot of books floating around. Normally, what you had to do was go find a lawyer who already had copies of Blackstone on his shelf and then work out some kind of deal with them. You normally had to clerk for that lawyer. It's like, hey, dude, I'll do your paperwork for you and empty your waste paper baskets and all that stuff. If you'll let me read these books, I need to pass the bar. But Lincoln didn't even have to do that. Stewart was a good friend. Stewart didn't ask Lincoln to do anything. He just loaned him the books and said, here you go, man, go for it. And then Lincoln spent the next several years, this took him a long time, mastering Blackstone. Lincoln would later say, it takes me a long time to learn things. He once said that his mind was like a piece of steel. very, very difficult to make a scratch in, but once you got the scratch in, it was also impossible to get out. All right, so it's a very slow process. They say that when he was working in a general store, he'd be sitting there flipping through Blackstone while he was serving customers. There's one story that he was plowing a cornfield one time with Blackstone propped up on the plow. I can't imagine that worked so well. Okay, but he was doing that. Okay, several years of intense study of Blackstone. When he got done, get this, guys, he didn't even have to take a written exam. And that really makes my lawyer friends mad, you know, because they're like, oh my God, you gotta be kidding me. Here's what you did. You read the books, you figure you know them. You go find the local judge, because there'd be a judge for a state circuit court somewhere in the county you live in. You find the judge, go to the judge and say, Judge, I want to be a lawyer. And then the judge or somebody appointed by the judge would ask you a few questions. If you didn't seem like a complete moron, they'd make you a lawyer. I mean, it's that easy. All right. Give you an idea about this. Later on in his career, after Lincoln was a lawyer, he was acting as the bar examiner for one of the counties in Illinois. And this young kid goes to this judge and says, Judge, I want to be a lawyer. I'm ready. And the judge goes, hey, Lincoln's in charge of that, so go find him. And they were on the circuit, so Lincoln staying in a hotel. So the kid goes to the hotel, bangs on the door, opens the door, and there's Lincoln standing there with a bunch of shaving cream in his face because he's shaving, and tells him Lincoln what he wants to do. And Lincoln says, well, fine, go sit on the bed over there. And while Lincoln's finishing up his shaving, he's asking this kid questions. When he gets done, he wipes off his face, gets a piece of paper, writes down on the piece of paper, Dear Judge, give this young man a law license. He's a good deal smarter than he looks. A. Lincoln. That tells you how really informal this stuff was. Okay, so Lincoln reads Blackstone, masters it apparently, goes to, we don't know much of anything about this, guys. We don't know which judge, we don't know what the judge asked him, but he goes to some judge there in the area, passes the exam, such as it was. And then what they would do is they would enter the young man's name and say in the docket book for the court in that county, Abraham Lincoln is considered to be a man of good moral character and is hereby admitted to the bar of Illinois. So that's what he did. He did this in like 1836. Now, that's all well and good. Woo! I'm a lawyer. Now, you know, I mean, this is where most young men fail back then. You could get a law license, not that hard to do, but then you got to put a practice together. That's the hard part. All right, and, you know, actually getting people to come to you and say, litigate my cases. Lincoln got really lucky because right when he got his law license, John Todd Stewart, the guy that loaned him the books, lost his law partner. He had a law partner named Henry Dummer, really unfortunate last name for a lawyer, by the way, Dummer, okay? But Mr. Dummer left Illinois to go back east to practice law. Stewart doesn't have a law partner. So, I mean, this is really, really lucky. Lincoln kind of falls into this because Stewart says, hey, do you want to be my partner? And he's like, yeah, I mean, that's beautiful, okay? So Lincoln becomes John Todd Stewart's law partner. And guys, this is a difficult period in Abraham Lincoln's life. All right. And it's not just law practice stuff. If you know anything about Lincoln and his stormy, and I'm going to emphasize stormy relationship with Mary Todd, a lot of that is going on. They break off their engagement. Lincoln falls into a deep depression. He's got all kinds of problems with his love life. And then at the same time, he becomes a brand new minted lawyer. And then right after that, John Todd Stewart gets elected to Congress. So he becomes a lawyer, and then the senior partner says, okay, Abe, this is all yours. I'm headed to DC. So Stewart heads off to DC. Now Lincoln has got all of the practice that he has to handle. I mean, wow, you know, and the truth is, guys, these were difficult years for him starting off. He made mistakes. All right. We know this from his correspondence. You know, he misplaced pleadings. He would file the wrong paperwork. One of my favorite letters from him is to some client during this time, and we don't have the other letter, but he's like, dear Mr. So-and-so, I've received your letter of the 18th. wanting to know what's going on with your case. I'm sorry to tell you that we've lost the paperwork for your case. I'm terribly sorry, sir. If we knew this was that important to you, I would have looked harder. It's like, dude, oh my God, you know. So I mean, he's messing up. Okay. He also doesn't know how to carry himself. Numerous eyewitness accounts at the time say that he's still dressing like he wants to go plow a cornfield. I mean, you walk into a courtroom and his suit is all funky, and we all know Lincoln, right, guys? I mean, the man didn't comb his hair right, the tie would be askew. He looked like a redneck. Okay, I mean, I've ever one client who traveled to have the firm of Stewart and Lincoln represent him. Apparently, he'd not met these guys. Walks into the room. Lincoln's standing there and he says, well, where's John Todd Stewart? And Lincoln says, he's in Congress. I'm your lawyer. And the guy later said, Lincoln looked like such a hillbilly that I fired him on the spot and got another lawyer. I don't know what he was wearing. All right. About bib overalls or something, but he just looked like a hick, you know? So he struggles, guys. The first couple of years with this situation, he struggles. He's able to power through. I'd say he's still probably doing more good work than bad, but he's kind of clawing his way through. After a while, Stewart comes back home. Stewart had decided that he had another man in mind that he wanted to partner with, and tells Lincoln he wants to dissolve the partnership. As far as we can tell, this was not hostile. They weren't mad at each other. They stayed good friends the rest of their lives. But Stewart wanted to move on. Lincoln now is he's out of a job. He's lost his partnership, and here's where fate steps in a second time. The judge before whom he had tried many cases, including his very first case, was a guy named Stephen Logan. The guy Stephen Logan was really eccentric. I've seen a couple of drawings. He had this wild mane of white hair. You guys remember the Carol Burnett show? You guys remember Tim Conway's old man routine? Looks just like Tim Conway. I mean, he just looks really weird. And he was into whittling. So Judge Logan would be listening to an argument and be whittling while they were talking. There'd be wood chips flying everywhere, and the clerks are all picking him up. So he's kind of weird, okay? But Logan has a first-rate legal mind. He's one of the most respected legal minds in all of Illinois. And he had seen something in Lincoln that he liked. And right when Lincoln loses his first partner, Logan approaches him and says, Lincoln, I hear you lost your partnership. Interestingly, Logan had decided to resign being a judge and go back to being a trial lawyer because, get this, guys, he made more money that way. I mean, life was different back then. He decided he could make more money being a lawyer, so he resigned to being a judge, goes back to being a lawyer, needs a partner, and there's Lincoln. Lincoln comes on board with him, and guys, Stephen Logan is one of the unsung heroes of Lincoln's life. Probably a name that the vast majority of people have never heard of, but it is Stephen Logan that, to put the matter bluntly, he cleaned Lincoln up. All right. He taught Lincoln how to do the paperwork. He taught Lincoln how to do proper legal research. He taught Lincoln how to handle things like, jury pleadings and case law, the technical aspects. He tells Lincoln, "Hey, dude, you don't be dressing like that in the courtroom. You look like a fool." I mean, he straightens Lincoln out and professionalizes him. And I mean, everybody knew this, guys. I mean, I've seen people that said if it wasn't for Stephen Logan, Lincoln never would have made it. All right, but Logan steps up, and by the time he's partnered with Logan for about 4 years, and by the time he gets done, Lincoln's a good lawyer. All right, he's kind of baptized through fire. He cuts through that. Then Logan's son gets a law license, and Logan goes to Lincoln and says, Abe, my son just got a law license. I want to help my kid out, so I'd like to dissolve our partnership. And again, there's no animosity here. Lincoln seems to totally understood, and they part ways amicably. And as with Stewart, they remain friends. So it's not really anything really ugly. Guys, at this point, Lincoln's been a lawyer for about 10 years. And he is now he's well thought of, he's well respected. Now it's not, I'm desperate to go partner with somebody. Now he's got people trying to partner with him because he's got his own following, he's got his own caseload, he's got that kind of thing. And a young man comes to him who had actually been studying for the bar in the Logan and Lincoln law office. He knew this young man. His name was William Herndon. Herndon comes to Lincoln and says, would you consider bringing me on as a partner? And Lincoln seems to have liked him, and he agrees. And Herndon was Lincoln's third and last law partner. They partner all the way up until Lincoln leaves for the White House in 1861. Now, guys, I don't know what you guys know about Lincoln lore and all the weird byways of Lincoln scholarship. I mean, Billy Herndon is well known for a lot of reasons, good and not so good. Billy was an interesting person, all right. He had a tendency to be really opinionated, and he shared his opinions quite liberally with everybody. He tended to be known as a confrontational kind of, frankly, kind of a blowhard. He also had a pretty bad drinking problem. Lincoln bailed him out of the drunk tank in Springfield on a couple of occasions. Billy did not get along with Mary Lincoln at all. We can talk about that later if you want to. That's not pretty, okay? But Billy was actually a really good law partner. They complemented each other really well. Billy Herndon didn't like talking to juries. His personality just didn't fit that. He got nervous and uptight and all that. I've got one nice little snippet where Lincoln's trying to calm him down while he's getting ready to do a rare jury trial. He's not good at juries. He's not good at that kind of thing. Billy has a college education, and he's very good at research. On the other hand, Lincoln was never bad at research, but it wasn't his strong point. He could do it, and he did do it, and he knew how to do technical law, but he wasn't comfortable in it. He was much more comfortable in front of a jury. So they complement each other really well. You know, they fit together like a glove professionally. So they put together their law practice, and they opened their practice in downtown Springfield. Lincoln had several law offices during his time as a lawyer, at least three. There may have been more. We're kind of unsure about that. By all accounts, guys, the Lincoln and Herndon law office was an epic mess. I mean, even other lawyers would go into their office and go, oh my God, you got to be kidding me. First of all, their main law, the one they had for the longest time, was situated over a stable. Okay, I mean, you can imagine what that smelled like. They said, clients would walk in and go, God, what is that? And so they had to leave the windows shut, and the windows hadn't been cleaned in like years, so you couldn't see out the windows. Okay, so you walk in, there's like this cavernous room, and there's just stuff everywhere. And then down the middle of the thing was this big long table covered in green cloth with just crap piled all over it. And then in the middle of that was a big stack of papers tied up in a string with a note on top in Lincoln's handwriting that said, if you can't find it anywhere else, look here. That was his filing system, all right? And then he had books all piled up in here. And then the place was so dirty that they had a client who had paid their legal fee in bean seeds. Okay, some client had given them a bag of bean seeds instead of money, and they're like, okay, fine. They threw it in the corner. There was so much dirt on the floor that the bean plants were growing out of the corner of the room when you walked in. I was like, whoa, I mean, apparently their law office was scary bad. And then on the occasions that Lincoln's kids came to visit, it got worse, because if you know anything about Lincoln as a father, he was indulgent to the point of he let those kids do anything. Billy later wrote, he said, Robert and it was Robert and Willie primarily. Robert and Willie would come in, and man, they would just throw papers everywhere. They'd spill ink stands. They would do all kinds of stuff. Billy Herndon later said, if they had crapped in Lincoln's boots, he would have laughed and called it right smart. I mean, the place was just an epic nightmare. All right. But they didn't spend much time there. Guys, back in those days, you couldn't stay sitting in your law office and wait for business to come to you. It just didn't work that way. You're going to go broke, all right? What you had to do was you had to go get the business. And the way you did that was called riding the circuit. See, here's how this worked. The state of Illinois was cheap, okay? They don't want to pay to put a judge in every county. They're not going to pay the salaries of all these judges. What they did was they had the state divided into circuits, And the circuit that Lincoln was practicing on was the 8th Judicial Circuit, which is kind of like a belt across the middle of Illinois, all right? And included Sangamon County where he lived, but other stuff too. So they had like 20 counties. They had one judge for all these counties in the circuit. The judge twice a year would saddle up or get in a carriage or whatever. And then later on, when they had railroads, they get on a railroad car, but usually a carriage. He would get in his carriage and the judge would go to each county seat, and all the local farmers in that area would know what was court day. You know, they okay, on the 8th of every other month, the judge is going to show up, and they'd open up the courthouse and the judge pops in. And if you wanted to go see your neighbor Bob for stealing your pig, now's your chance, buddy. Okay. And riding with the judge would be a coterie of lawyers, usually about a dozen lawyers who are following the judge around, riding the circuit from county to county to go litigate the cases that might come up. And if you can imagine what this would have been like, I mean, you're Lincoln, man. You're a lawyer. They said that, like every other lawyer back then, he would stuff his saddlebags full of the books that he might need to litigate a case. He'd have his stuff in the saddlebags. They'd ride into town and they'd say, okay, next day is court day. And then people would gather around, and Lincoln might be standing there, and some dude walk up and say, hi, Lincoln, my name's George. There's my neighbor Fred down there. He owes me 15 bucks. He won't give it back to me. I want to sue. So then you have to go figure out the case, and then you try the case, and then you go on to the next. This is life as a lawyer in Lincoln's time. Most lawyers hated riding the circuit because the roads were bad, the food was awful, the conditions were miserable. Most lawyers only rode part of the circuit, just enough to pay their bills. Then they went back home because they wanted to be with their families. Lincoln was the only one of the lawyers in the 8th Circuit group that stayed out on the entire circuit twice a year and never missed a day. By all accounts, he loved riding the circuit. Billy Herndon, who, as I said, didn't really care for Mary Lincoln all that much, later claimed that Lincoln was out on the circuit to get away from Mary. I don't know if that's true, okay, but that's what he's doing to drum up practice. And guys, I'm gonna get into this a little bit here later. Think about how many people he would have met doing that. You know, we're talking about a politician here, a guy who's running for office, and people that knew him said, oh my God, the guy knows everybody in Illinois because he meets them all the time. You know, I mean, this is one of those subtle places that people don't talk about when they do Lincoln. They don't talk about the fact this was the foundation of not just how he paid his bills, but how he met people, including fellow lawyers. You know, several of those lawyers later went on to be very important in his presidential career. Just to give you one example, one of the lawyers he rode around circuit with was a guy from Virginia named Ward Hill Lamon. Lamon would later go to D.C. with him and be his bodyguard, and then was the constable of Washington, D.C. And even more important was the judge that he followed on the 8th Judicial Circuit, a guy named David Davis. David Davis was a gargantuan man. They estimated he weighed like 300 pounds even back then, which was kind of rare. They said he had to have a 4-horse buggy to haul him around because he was so darn fat. Okay, he's huge, but he's a very wily political operator as well as a judge. Guys, it was David Davis who, more than any other single man, helped get Lincoln the nomination at the 1860 Republican Convention. And Lincoln, who knows how to reward his friends during the war, puts David Davis on the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, so these are important people in Lincoln's presidential life that he's meeting all the way back then. And there was a camaraderie to these guys. They said that Lincoln had the best jokes around. He would sit around, regaling people with all these great stories. Again, he's networking with people. One of my favorite stories was he was out in the circuit, and a lot of the times they had to share accommodations. I mean, the hotels were dingy and small, or if there wasn't even a hotel, they had to put up in a person's house. But he and David Davis were sharing a room in a hotel, and one of the other lawyers went looking for Lincoln, and he went up these stairs and opened the door to the hotel room, and Abraham Lincoln, 6'2", skinny as a rail, David Davis, 300-pound fat dude, are engaged in a gargantuan pillow fight. The guy opens the door, just feathers go flying. Here's Lincoln, wham, 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 and he's just beating the crap out of Davis, and Davis is laughing so hard he can't hardly get his own pillow up. And the guy's going, whoa, that's interesting. So you get the feel for this whole thing, right? This is the way Lincoln lived his life as his lawyer. Now, what kind of law did he practice? And that's a really good question. And by the way, we didn't know much about what kind of law he practiced until, really, believe it or not, the year 2000. The state of Illinois, and if you've ever been to Illinois, Illinois loves them some Lincoln. All right, they paid a bunch of historians and their assistants pretty good money to go around to every courthouse in the 8th Judicial Circuit and dig out every scrap of paper related to the Lincoln law practice. It took them 10 years to do this, all right? And they unearthed from about 1990 to about 2000, get this, guys, 90,000 new documents about the Abraham Lincoln law practice. I mean, those of us who are practicing historians, when's the last time you heard about somebody finding 90,000 new documents about anything in the Civil War, right? I mean, this was a treasure trove. And then this being the year 2000, they digitized them and put them on a DVD database. Oh my God, the thing was so great. I got that. And I'd be sitting there in my office and I'd be banging away on the keyboard, and I have a student walk by and I go, dude, come in here, man. I found a Lincoln larceny case, and they'd be going, Dirk, you need to get a life, buddy. That's really sad, But anyway, so we only have recent good information about what cases he's actually litigating. The fact of the matter is, guys, lawyers back then did not specialize. They rarely did. You don't have what we have today. Oh, I do probate. Oh, I do contracts. What's that guy we have down here in Indiana? His nickname's the Hammer. He's got like billboards all over the place where he deals with truck accidents. Some of you guys got that up in Michigan, but I mean, people hyper specialize in the law these days. You didn't do that back then. And you couldn't make a living that way. So the fact of the matter is, Lincoln litigated just every case you can imagine, criminal and civil law. Guys, again, the numbers I would give you would be, I try to avoid the whole numbers because we know for a fact that we don't have all the documents. A couple of these courthouses had fires that we know burned stuff, so we don't know how many cases we're talking about, so we can't really do percentages. But we do know that his criminal law practice was considerably less than 50%. In other words, most of the time, he's not doing criminal law. Although, interestingly enough, of course, those cases are the ones that are the most famous. The famous Almanac case. I don't know how many of you guys might have seen a really old movie called Young Mr. Lincoln back in the day. Henry Fonda played Lincoln, and it revolves around a murder trial. A guy named Duff Armstrong was accused of beating another man to death in a drunken rage during a camp revival. I guess he wasn't hearing the word of Jesus over there. He's beating the crap out of this other guy. So and Lincoln became his defense attorney because Duff Armstrong's mother knew Lincoln from back in the day, and she begs him to save her son's life. This is all true, by the way. It's in the movie, but it's also quite true. And he was reluctant to do it because Lincoln didn't do that many murder trials. We always want Lincoln to be like Law and Order. Okay, well, no, he didn't do this very often, and I think he was really reluctant to take a murder case because you got to do his life writing on this, and he didn't do it. And he ends up getting Duff Armstrong acquitted because one of the eyewitnesses claimed he saw the deed because it had a light of a full moon, and Lincoln supposedly walked across the courtroom with the almanac and slammed it down the table and said, here's an almanac. You couldn't have seen it because there was no moon that night. Some of you guys may have heard this. It's like his really famous case. The truth is, guys, those were rare. He didn't do much criminal law. He did a little bit here and there. Mostly he was doing what you might call business law, guys. Look, I know this is kind of dull, but the fact of the matter is he was mostly a debt collector. And I tell people that and they're like, oh God, that sounds boring. Well, okay, well, maybe it is, but that's what he did. Because guys, back in those days, they didn't have credit ratings. They didn't have skip tracers. They didn't have collection agencies. None of that stuff existed yet. If your neighbor owes you money, and they're not paying you, you only have one place to go, and that is to a lawyer. And that, guys, that was his bread and butter. I broke down his practice year by year by year. Debt collection was like the foundation. Okay, he always knew he could count on the debt collection because people owed money everywhere. And on the Illinois frontier, nobody's got cash, man. These IOUs would just circulate like paper money all over Illinois. I'm going to give this to this guy. I'm going to give this to this guy. A lot of his time was spent just tracking down those little pieces of paper and finding out who's got it and then trying to get all the money back. I mean, it's tedious, but it's really important, okay? Because I mean, if you can't guarantee there's a dude out there like Lincoln that's going to get your money, you're not going to loan it in the first place, and the economy just sort of grinds to a halt. In my book, I compared this to Lincoln being the legal equivalent of grease. He's the grease in the machine. Other people are running the businesses. He's the grease that keeps the wheels turning, because you are going to loan money if you know you've got a guy out there like Lincoln that can go get your money for you. He represented the creditor far more often than the debtor. I mean, like 70% of the time. And I've seen some scholars who say, well, that means he sympathized with big business. But I think that's an erroneous read. I think it's just the creditors are more likely to be around. If you're a debtor back then, story goes that, if a guy owes somebody else money and they send the sheriff out to collect the money, and they go up to the front door and they see the lawyer's GTT carved in the front door, that supposedly meant gone to Texas. And buddy, you ain't ever getting your money back. I mean, debtors would just hightail it on out of there, and then there it is. So I think that's why he's representing more creditors than anybody else. He also has a smattering of divorce cases, more than you might think. There was more divorce going on at the local level than you might think was possible back then. And these divorce cases are absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, you read about domestic abuse, you read about rape, you read about all this really ugly stuff that he would have seen every day. I always get asked about slavery, and the involvement of slavery in his caseload. Guys, he didn't litigate many cases for African Americans under any circumstances. I think I counted a total, we're talking thousands of cases. The numbers flying out of my head. I think I saw, I think he litigated maybe 40 cases that somehow involved Black people, either directly or indirectly. So African Americans are not a big professional presence in his life. And then you see people who look at some of the cases he litigated and say, oh, well, Lincoln was a racist because he represented the interest of a Kentucky slaveholder who was trying to get his slave back. Now, that part is true. There was a case called the Matson case, where this guy named Matson had land he owned in Illinois, and he was taking his slaves out of Kentucky and into Illinois to work his farms up in Illinois, and then bringing them back. And one time when they went up there, these two slaves escaped and got a lawyer and said, the minute you went into Illinois, this is free territory, we're not slaves anymore. And if that sounds familiar, this is kind of a little miniature Dred Scott case. Lincoln represented the interests of Matson trying to get his slaves back. And I've seen people go, well, that must mean he was a bigot, didn't care about slavery. Guys, you can't draw that conclusion, because he also litigated cases where he was defending men who were on the Underground Railroad trying to hide fugitive slaves. For Lincoln, where it came to slavery, I mean, in politics, guys, Lincoln always hated slavery, never had one kind word to say about it, and there's no doubt about that. As a lawyer, though, he put on a different hat. And as a lawyer, his take on this would have been, okay, I got a client coming in here. He's got a legitimate case. I have a moral obligation to represent his particular interests. So we can talk about that later if you want to. But so this is kind of what his law practice looked like. Now, towards the end of the 1850s, as he's becoming more prominent, his money gets better. He stops representing so many little nickel and dime debt collection cases. And I've actually heard him described as a corporate lawyer for railroads. I think that's a little much, but he was actually representing a number of railroad corporations In fact, the biggest retainer he ever won was for the Illinois Central Railroad, where he got $5,000, which is a big chunk of money back then. He leaves for the White House in 1861. Billy Herndon later said, as they were walking out the law office door, Billy pointed to the shingle over their door that said Lincoln and Herndon. And Billy says to Abe, he says, Abe, what do you want me to do about that? And Lincoln said, you leave it right there, because when I come back home, we will just resume our practice like we always did. And there's no reason to disbelieve him, guys. I mean, the law was his life. It was how he paid his bills. It was how he saw things day in and day out. And I think that is an underrated feature of his Civil War leadership. Guys, stop and think about what it would have been like to be on the circuit day in and day out, and the people that you would have interacted with. I mean, I was struck when I read all these cases about how Lincoln saw the worst in people time and time and time again. He saw husbands and wives at each other's throats. He saw people owing each other money and suing them over it. He saw arguments among families over contested wills. He saw, guys, the law gave him a sort of a bird's eye view of how awful people could behave towards each other. And what lawyers learn today, and I did some research into modern legal thinking, lawyers today are learning what's called client management. Now, I don't think they used that term back then, but I think Lincoln probably acquired the same basic skills. It was like, you don't get emotionally involved in the case. Every lawyer's told that. I don't know if any of you guys are actually lawyers in here, but I'm not a lawyer, guys, but I talked to some friends who were lawyers. Yeah, they all taught you, you don't, if you're a criminal lawyer, you don't ask your client if he's guilty, man, because you don't want to know. Okay. You want to give that guy the best defense they can have and let it all sort itself out. You don't get emotionally involved. And I see that in Lincoln's law practice. Guys, he couldn't get emotionally involved with his clients, and he could, from what I can see, he didn't cherry pick his clients. There was a claim by people that loved Lincoln that, well, he only took good people to be his clients, or he only took cases that involved moral right and wrong. That's a bunch of crap, guys. Okay, he took anybody, okay, because that's what he did. And I think that taught him how to work with people with whom he would have disagreed or who he found unsavory. I'll tell you the real telling comparison here. Compare him to Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was not a lawyer. He was a military man. And Jefferson Davis wanted and expected the people around him to be friends, good people. It's one reason why he stuck with Braxton Bragg past the point of all reason, because they were buddies from West Point, or Leonidas Polk, for God's sake. Okay, I mean, Davis did that all the time. Davis had this thing where he could only work with people who he felt had their hearts in the right place, and people knew how to handle him that way. Lincoln wasn't like that. I mean, God, Lincoln could work with anybody. The man could work with George McClellan, for God's sake. He worked with Joe Hooker. There's that famous letter from Joe Hooker in which he cracks a joke about being a dictator. Lincoln says, you know what, dude, I will handle the rest. You worry about, I'll handle the dictatorship. You just win battles. That was Lincoln's attitude time and time and time again during the war. Just to quote Al Davis, if you're a football fan, just win, baby. Okay. I don't care if you're a good person or a bad person. I don't care if you drink a lot as a general. We all know the famous legend, which probably is untrue. Okay. But about Grant, where people say Grant's a drunkard, and he says, well, find out what his whiskey brand is. I'll send a keg to every general in the army or whatever. I don't think he actually said that, but that's kind of his spirit. Okay. It's like the law practice teaches him this. Okay. You get people to work towards a solution to a problem. You don't stop to ask if they're good people or not. You don't stop to ask, do I like this guy? You don't have that kind of luxury when you have this kind of law practice. And guys, Lincoln was famous for this. During the war, he said, in politics, there should be short statutes of limitations. In other words, John Hayes, personal secretary, he didn't take anything personally. He just do the job. You can be an ass if you want to. Just be an ass who wins things, and I can live with that. I see that as coming out of his experiences as a lawyer and dealing with all of these different people with all these different sketchy situations. Okay, guys, well, I'll open it up to questions if anybody has anything about his law practice or anything. We're kind of close to time here. I don't want to run you guys over, but Jim, what do you want to do?
Okay. First of all, we do not traditionally record the questions just in case somebody makes a fool of himself. So first, let me take care of that.